life of trouble. Only words depart. Short life of trouble, dear girl, poor boy with a broken heart.
These old Appalachian mountains have definitely produced many great musicians over the years, all steeped in the oral musical traditions carried over by ship from the old countries, traditions passed down from generation to generation. Some of these musicians you have heard of, many you have not. Born in 1887, Gilliam Banmon Grayson is one mountain fiddler that very few have ever heard of. Nearly blind from birth, he was a true son of the Appalachian Mountains, with music running through his veins. Living almost his entire life in tiny Laurel Bloomery, located in Johnson County, the easternmost part of Tennessee, GB could sing and play the guitar, harmonica, organ, piano, mandolin, and even the banjo. But where he made his mark was with the fiddle, and what a mark it was. Between October 1927 to October 1929, Grayson, along with his partner Henry Whittier, would record 32 songs and would become overnight radio stars, selling thousands of records in the early days of what would become known as country music. But as quickly as it happened, it was gone in a flash, with Grayson's tragic death in August 1930. Since that fateful date, Grayson's 32 songs have become standards in old-time bluegrass and country music. They are literally played everywhere across the globe and have been covered by the biggest stars, including the Kingston Trio, Bob Dylan, the Stanley Brothers, and even Mick Jagger. And yet, almost nobody knows that G.B. Grayson was the very first to either write or record these amazing tunes.
Lord God, I got them Lee Highway Blues.
I can't think of somebody who's been more influential on the canon of old-time music than G.B. Grayson and Henry Whittier.
Some folks are born to die. Tell 'em, boy, tell 'em.
I think people don't know how influential G.B. Grayson is, because certain things, whether it be a song repertoire or a fiddle player actually having the audacity to sing, playing the fiddle, or having that kind of distilled sound of just two instruments and focusing on the song. Look at the influence that G.B. had on Ralph Stanley. And probably every bluegrass band that's ever put fiddle and mandolin and banjo together has sung, "Oh, yonder stands little Maggie with a wine glass in her hand. She's drinking down her troubles with that no good gambling man." And that's directly from Grayson and Whittier. You know, they gave us that song so that we could sing, and many others. But and if you ask this said bluegrass band, where'd that come from? They would probably say, "Oh, the Stanley Brothers." And not knowing that if you asked Ralph Stanley, where did you learn that? He'd say, "Oh, G.B. Grayson."
So G.B. Grayson was an almost blind fiddler who was enormously talented. In his short life, he recorded a very small repertoire but almost everything he recorded has become a standard of old-time or bluegrass music. He recorded Handsome Molly, he recorded the Ballad of Tom Dooley, which is sung the world over.
Hang your head, Tom Dooley, hang your head and cry. Kill poor Laura Foster and you know you're bound to die. Took her by the roadside where you begged to be excused. You took her by the roadside and you hid her clothes and shoes.
Music is community, right? And music is culture as well. And in the early period, say the early 20th century, right, those early 1900s or the late 1800s and up through the Depression, in this area it would be pretty tough to make a living. It was a very agrarian, very rural society. People were raising, like my grandmother, who would have been born in 25, you know, she always said we raised what we had to eat.
Music was just part of who these people are. And when you look at the instruments that they played, besides the fiddles and the guitars and the banjos, you know, the washboards and the spoons, the fact that those things ever became instruments, were used as musical instruments, is a testimony to how important music were to our people. They heard music everywhere.
Down in the willow garden where me and my love did meet, oh, there we sit a-courting, my love dropped off to sleep. I had a bottle of the Burglar.
Well, we don't know a lot about Grayson's early life. He was born in 1887. That much we know. We don't really even know where he was born. There's two competing theories. One is that he was born somewhere in Ashe County. His mother, on a census record in, I think, 1900, where she had to list the birthplace of all her children, she listed his birthplace as Tennessee, though. So he could have been born in Laurel Bloomery. He was raised by his mother in Laurel Bloomery. His father, Benjamin, was suffering from illnesses he contracted during the Civil War, and he died when GB was really young, about 5 or 6 years old, I believe. And then his mother died when he was 15. And because he was left alone with no parents, and because he had a substantial blindness deficiency, which made it very difficult for him to see, he was eligible to collect his father's Civil War pension. His father had been collecting a disability pension because his father fought for the Union during the Civil War. Him and his uncle, James W.M., both had fought for the Union. And as a consequence of that, he was collecting a Civil War disability pension. When he died, GB was eligible for it and started receiving the disability pension, which he got all the way up till the day he died. So when he died in 1930, he was still collecting a Civil War disability pension. That was his primary source of income.
There were different stories about how my grandfather went blind. The way I heard it from Aunt Lily, his daughter, was that he was held up to the window on a snowy day, and that the sun, he was snowblind.
Oh, yonder stands little Maggie with a trampling.
As far as the music goes, where he learned to play is another big mystery. One of his daughter claimed that he was surrounded by musicians. His father played, his mother played, it was just music everywhere. But his father died when he was 5. I've heard no evidence from any other people who might be inclined to know that they played. There's a family story that he taught himself to play the banjo by sitting in a high-back chair, kind of like this one, and that his feet wouldn't touch the ground, so he would tap the bottom rung of the chair while he sat in it, and he used that to keep time. He played the banjo every bit as much as he played the fiddle. All through his life, he never recorded with it.
I think he really mainly was self-taught, and I think that explains a little bit about his style, the way he held the fiddle low. That helped him to be able to sing while he played, because if you hold it up on your chin, it's hard to sing. Not very many fiddle players can sing and play the fiddle at the same time, even if they did hold it low.
Yeah.
But he could.
Do you remember before you showed me how you remembered that he held his fiddle?
Oh yes,
Could
yeah.
you, could you
like
play
this.
a little of something and do that again?
He held his fiddle down like this. I can't just exactly, but it's the way he played about all the time. I can't play like that, but that's the way he held his fiddle like that. Play a little bit of the Big-Eyed Rabbit there. Rabbit-tails, mighty white, yes, my Lord, I'm getting out of sight. Are you in there, rabbit? Are you in there now? Are you in there, rabbit? I'm getting there now.
Actually, the old style, like my dad played and like G.B. Grayson played in these mountains, come from England, Ireland. It was the bagpipes. They get the bagpipe sound on the fiddle by noting one string and sewing one open, and it would sound like a and when Dad and GB played a song, they would let the weight of the bow on the strings, you know, and they wouldn't, you know, a lot of fiddle players will do, you know, but they never done that. That was always just so smooth. That's why they were so smooth with it. You know. They'd go. Smooth.
Wish I was in London or some other seaport town. I'd step my foot in a steamboat, I'd sail this ocean round. And some Molly. Yee-hoo.
Well, Grayson was very motivated. He was very driven to perform. And largely, at least when it first started, that motivation was just one of subsistence. He was playing, he would kind of go out during the week. He'd be gone all week. It really was a full-time job, was playing music. So what he would do, sometimes they'd go out of town. Sometimes he went up in the coal mine, or up in the coal fields in West Virginia, and would play up there. But largely what he would do is he'd just travel from one house to another, and he'd just stay the night, and he'd play music, either for dances or just play in your house. And then you could feed him. He would work for money or for food sometimes, or sometimes people would pay him. They'd just take up a collection and pay him. And he played on street corners. He traveled all the time. He was always moving from Laurel Bloomery to Damascus. He rode the train down to West Jefferson from Damascus. He traveled around Ashe County, traveled through Horse Creek. He seemed to be everywhere in the area.
I mean, what was it like when he was around the house, and what'd you do?
Well, it was always just sit and talk. Of course, we know their place. We didn't butt in like kids do today. We just sat around and talked. Of course, he was, after he got to making records, he wasn't at home too much anyway. Mm-hmm. Usually gone on trips. But when he'd come home, it was always a happy reunion.
Did he play music at home a lot?
Oh, yeah, there was, well, most all the time, especially on the weekend, there was people would come here all the time, different ones. Mm-hmm. And he never refused nobody. If somebody wanted to play a certain song, he'd grab his old fiddle and play it.
Banmon Grayson and Tom Ashley were busking. And, you know, back in the 30s and 20s, it was hard, music was hard to come by. So they went up in the coal fields. And Tom would, he played the banjo, clawhammer banjo, and he would chuckle around there a little bit and get them a job. And they would be in a bar, and a big fight would break out. And Tom would grab Banmon around the neck and put him in front of him. You wouldn't hit a blind man now, would you? You wouldn't hit a blind man. But they said he'd done that many times.
So GB, if he wanted to make a living as a musician, as someone who was essentially blind, he would have had, I think, a variety of places where he could be playing. Of course, we mentioned Molasses making time. Molasses takes hours and hours, and you're up all night long, and music would be such a welcome release for that. But of course, they had their corn shuckings when people would get together, because a lot of this would be before mechanization, so a lot of this was handwork. Maybe church functions, be playing at church functions. Tobacco markets. We have to remember that tobacco markets would have been a really good place to play, especially if there was money changing hands. Any place there was money changing hands would have been a good place to play, especially for someone like GB trying to make his living as a musician. You want to be where the money is at.
I've always been a rambler, my fortune's been quite hard. Always loved the women, drink whiskey and play cards. My parents treated me kindly as they had no boy but me. My mind was bent on rambling, at home I couldn't agree.
1925 Fiddlers Convention. For people who know anything about early country music, they look at that picture and they say, this has got to be photoshopped. I mean, there was no way that G.B. Grayson and Fiddlin' John Carson, who was a superstar, I mean, he recorded here in Atlanta and sold 500,000 albums of the old Hen Cackles and the Rooster's Gonna Crow.
Well, up here in Johnson County, people say, well, if that's the birthplace, it was first conceived in Mountain City, you know. People get a kick out of that.
Why did they say that?
Well, because of the Fiddlers Convention in 1925, 2 years before, G.B. Grayson was there, Uncle Am Stewart, Fiddlin' John Carson, the Moonshine Kate, all the Hillbillies, all these other I mean, you look at it now and it's like, wow, you know, all these guys were here in Mountain City. They had it over at the old high school, and there were so many people that it caved in. And first place was a $20 gold piece.
And it was exciting because people came to Mountain City both to listen and to see people they'd only heard on the radio.
The Hillbillies had come in to play. They were recorded artists for OK. Elvis Alderman was their fiddle player. And Elvis Alderman was real big into gadgets and technology, and he had rigged up a portable radio transmitter that had very little range. It could only range, you know, several miles, but it worked. And he set that up in the hotel at Mountain City, and he got the musicians who were competing in the festival to come play on this homemade radio transmitter. And it would reach all the way to Boone from Mountain City. And people started calling the Mountain City Hotel from Boone and requesting songs. So it's kind of like a real primitive sort of Grand Ole Opry, which started around the same time in Nashville in very much the same way. And I think that really is a moment of revelation for him about the power of radio, the power of recorded music to take you in a place that you couldn't get to riding on running boards and riding on trains. So after that 25 Fiddlers Convention, he seems to have started directing himself towards trying to pursue a more professional kind of musical career rather than just busking on street corners. And that's what led him to Henry Whittier, who in 1927 was in Mountain City and who had all these industry connections. Henry Whittier was lacking in the talent. He'd kind of been surpassed by a later artist, but he still knew Ralph Peer, who he'd known from the OK days, who ran the recording sessions. He'd recorded at the Bristol sessions Henry Whittier had. So Henry Whittier knew people, knew connections, knew people in New York, knew how to get a record made, and it was just a good combination of the two of them. Whittier was lacking in the talent but knew the people, and Grayson had all the talent but didn't know anybody.
The partnership of Grayson and Whittier, you know, the joke is it was the blind fiddle player and the deaf guitar player. And in all fairness, I think on most of the recordings, Henry was a solid backup guitar player.
Wise man born to die. Tell 'em, boy, tell 'em.
So at that point in time, to be a full-time musician, part-time musician, to be a musician at large, you'd have had to have been a good showman. You'd had to put on a good show.
Like the fact that he was the showman that he was,
That-
and do we kind of take that into what we do today?
We do that.
You
And,
know.
you know, if you go back and listen to any of those G.B. Grayson, Henry Whittier recordings, they were doing such a service at the time for people all over the world. You listen to those recordings, they're lively. It's like they're playing in their living room
Yeah.
to people. They're hooping
They
and hollering
captured that.
in the middle. You know, to be able to capture that in studio form
That's hard.
is nearly impossible.
But GB was very unique and special and original, and just as fascinating to listen to as he pulls from this oral tradition of all these old songs and tunes like Cluck Old Hen, songs that have such a rich, long heritage that probably came over right with the first migrants to the United States and would eventually settle in these mountains. But it's GB's version, right? It's how GB interprets the music, which makes it special. My old hen, she won't do. She lays eggs for the railroad crew, sometimes 8 and sometimes 10. That's enough eggs for the railroad men. Now cluck old hen, cluck and squaw. We ain't laid an egg since way last fall. Cluck old hen, cluck and bummer. We ain't laid an egg since way last summer.
He sang Omi Wise, he sang Rose Conley, he sang Banks of the Ohio. Those are all ballads you can trace back pretty easily to England, Britain. But the majority of what he got was sheet music. And this sheet music was not something that you had to go searching around to find. It was an industry. Tin Pan Alley and these musicians, Gussie Davis, he recorded 2 different songs written by Gussie Davis, who was a professional black songwriter working in New York City, just churning out sheet music.
Some of the G.B. Grayson, Henry Whittier numbers that I'm more familiar with would definitely be Train 45, Handsome Molly, Rose Conley, which, you know, was later recorded. Charlie Monroe was Down in the Willow Garden, but that tune goes, you know, way back, even, you know, before they came along. He's Coming to Us Dead. That's one of my favorite numbers ever. Is He's Coming to Us Dead. Jokin' Henry, another number, and one of my personal favorites. I use this in my show to this day. Short Life of Trouble. I can't tell you what that song. That there's just so much emotion in that.
Short life of trouble, a few more words apart. Short life of trouble, you girl, or a boy with a broken heart. Remember what you promised, not more than a week ago. You promised that you'd marry me, standing in your arms. Short life of trouble, a few more words to part. Short life of trouble, dear girl, for a boy with a broken heart. One morning when the office had opened, a man quite old in years stood by the express office, showing signs of grief and tears. When the clerk approached him, in trembling words did say, I'm waiting for my boy, sir, he's coming home today.
Well, his death was very sudden and very unexpected. He left home on August 15th. The maudlin story is that his daughter, Rose, was on the porch, and he had Rose come sit on a porch swing, I think, could have been a chair with him, and he sang "Don't Go Out Tonight, My Darling," which is one of the songs he recorded with Whittier, and that was the last time the family ever saw him. He was going to Damascus to spend the night. He was going to try and arrange to buy his property, his house there. So he was meeting in Damascus trying to work that out. He met up with a guy named Steve Rupert who ran a wagon, a horse-drawn or oxen-drawn, I don't know which, wagon of tan bark back and forth from Laurel Bloomery to Damascus. And he'd arranged with Rupert to catch a ride with him back home the next morning on the wagon. He woke up on August 16th and he went to the spot where he was supposed to meet Rupert. And Rupert was going to give him a ride in the wagon back home to Laurel Bloomery, which was just a few miles down the road on Highway 91. And Rupert never showed up. He'd gotten delayed somewhere that morning. He got caught up doing something. He didn't make it on time. So Grayson was standing there waiting for his ride to show up. And Curtis Milhorn, who was another local resident, pulled up in this brand new Pontiac he had, a Pontiac coupe.
And it was full of young people. They picked him up. They knew him. But they didn't have enough room in the car for him to get inside. He was able to put his fiddle in the back seat on the laps of the people in the back seat, but he had to ride on the running board. Mm-hmm. So the driver of the Pontiac was driving erratically. And coming out of Damascus, of course the roads are changed now, the bridges are not like they were, but it was like the first bridge coming out of Damascus. When the man turned the turn, there was a logging truck, and he collided with the logging truck. Of course, my grandfather didn't have a very good hold on the running board, so he was thrown from the car. Actually, they think he was thrown through the windshield of the logging truck, where he dropped his pack of cigarettes out in the seat, and he went on through the passenger side and out over the bridge and into the creek. He had massive head injuries, but he did live long enough till they got him to Abingdon, but he was pronounced dead at Abingdon at the hospital.
Down in the willow garden where me and my love did meet, oh, there we sit a-courting, my love dropped off to sleep.
Yeah, you know, when you think about guys like G.B. Grayson and what it must have been like to step into a recording studio in 1927, to go to a city like Atlanta on a train when you're coming out of probably the biggest thing you ever saw was Kingsport, to go to Atlanta, eventually to go to New York, to go to Richmond, Indiana, to make the Jeanette series. I mean, all of these recording sessions that they did brought them out into a world that, though Henry Whittier was accustomed to it because he was citified, you know, G.B. Grayson's half blind and from one of the most isolated places in the East.
I think what changed early country music and made professional musicians possible were two things. It was the influence of the radio. And not everybody had a radio, but everybody listened to the radio. I mean, people would gather at people's houses when certain programs would come on. And the other thing that happened was mobility.
Train 45 leaving Terminal Station, Atlanta, Georgia. Oh, you ought to been uptown and seen that train come down. Hear the whistle blow 100 miles. Oh, Lord.
It's a testament to the power of recorded music. You know, if they'd never had records, he would have been, now this is important, he would have been very influential if they'd never invented a record, because like no other musician around here, he seems to have shaped up-and-coming musicians. But the recorded medium, the ability to make records, really launched him to the ability, he was able to scatter, those songs were able to be scattered out of, Tom Dooley. That ballad had floated around northwest North Carolina for 50 years, and nobody ever heard it. And then 30 years after G.B. Grayson's death, it's the #1 pop song in America.
Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, oh boy, you're bound to die.
Hang your head, Tom Dooley, hang your head and cry. Kill poor Laura Foster, you know you're bound to die.
Yeah, at the time, I was working for Rebel Records, which is the label that particular album was released on. The music of G.B. Grayson and Henry Whittier together, the duo, on the Stanley Brothers began early in their lives, long before they ever considered a career in music. Their family was one of the few homesteads in their mountain region of Southwest Virginia that had a wind-up phonograph record player. And one of the records that they had was an old '78 record by G.B. Grayson.
I think he wanted to show a new generation of folks that he who he was influenced by, and let them get exposed to their music, because I know he really respected them. And I remember we was working up the record and rehearsing it to do it, and he he was just all about it. I hadn't seen him excited like that. He was always glad to be doing a record, but I could tell it was something he was really excited to be doing a tribute to some of his heroes. It was actually Grammy nominated, the great tribute to Grayson and Whittier, Ralph Stanley. Well, I believe it was 1996, if I ain't mistaken. I was just, I might have been 18 years old or something when I was on that album.
I have no father in this world. Oh, I have no father in this world. He's sleeping tonight where the moon shines so bright on the banks of old Tennessee. On the banks of old Tennessee, Lord, Lord.
G.B. Grayson's music, I would say, is probably as popular in other countries as it is in the United States, maybe more so. Japan has got a thriving bluegrass scene. A lot of G.B. Grayson songs get played in Japan. Over in Europe, musicians from around here take tours of England, very popular over there. So yeah, I'd say his music at this point is everywhere.
My husband and I were living in Augsburg when my daughter came back to go to college. We were very blue, so we stopped off in Munich, where we had loved before, and thought we'll just walk around Munich and maybe that'll make us feel better. We were walking up a side street in Munich, and we heard music around the corner. We went around the corner, and there, sitting on the sidewalk all by himself, was a lone guitarist singing, "Hang down your head, Tom Dooley." And that just goes to prove the point that blind Banmon Grayson, as I learned to call him first of all, is known and loved around the world.
I think this music is going to survive. Joe Wilson said it was catching not a second wind, but a third wind. And, there's more old-time music being played in the world today than in the time of G.B. Grayson. And that's pretty exciting.
I enjoy playing this music because it's from around here where I grew up, and it's what I grew up listening to, and it sounds so much more real than everything else does. Some money
a lot of history in it, and it's not just the music. There's a lot of culture and heritage in it, and I feel like if I don't do it, or if other people don't do it, then we're not really keeping the music alive as much as we could. And I think that that's really important, because if we don't, then the history is most likely going to be lost.
I think if GB were to be able to look upon these modern times that we're living in, particularly as they relate to the music that he helped to preserve, I think he would look at all the young music makers, you know, kids learning to play Train 45 when they're 8 years old. I think he'd be really proud of the fact that Tom Dooley became one of the most iconic songs in American history. Roy Acuff says the thing that makes country music so special is that it's not a learned art form, but an inherited one. So I think the true value of G.B. Grayson's life is in the inheritance. He didn't get to spend it himself, but he amassed it, and it grew and grew, and now it's a fortune. And I am a recipient of it, and you are, and people watching today.
If I owned this whole wide world, all that's in it too, I'd give it all, both silver and gold, if I was only married to you. Short life of trouble, only words apart. Short life of trouble, dear girl, poor boy with a broken heart.
Well, having GB as my great-grandfather is a pleasure in itself, but knowing that he was part of the history that started music is really amazing. And for him to be recognized now, that's just mind-blowing for me, and it makes my heart want to burst with joy, because, you know, he's finally been recognized for what he started.
Short life of trouble. I'll tell you all a story about Omie Wise, how she was deluded by John Lewis's lies.
I think my granddad's impact on music was principally laying the foundation for, because so many artists, whether it be rock and roll or whether it be country, bluegrass, blues, or whatever, it always will lead back to the mountain music.